You've been carrying something that never had a name. It stayed quiet but constant, like a pressure just beneath the surface. It didn't shout, it didn't demand, it just lingered, waiting for your attention, and you kept looking away. Not because you were unaware, but because you were taught to interpret discomfort as weakness. You were told that endurance was noble, that staying silent made you strong. So you pushed it down. You played the part. You said yes when your instincts why speared no. Somewhere along the way, you stopped checking if your boundaries were still intact. Carl Jung understood the cost of this forgetting. He didn't ask us to condemn others, but to notice what corrodes us from within. He knew the most dangerous forms of harm weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet agreements we made with fear, guilt, and the need to belong. This isn't a list of moral flaws. It's an autopsy of the subtle ways you've been conditioned to shrink. These behaviors won't announce themselves. They won't look evil. In fact, they often wear the face of love, or kindness, or care. That's what makes them so lethal. And the longer you pretend not to see them, the deeper their roots go. Until you look in the mirror and wonder when your reflection stopped looking like someone who chose their life. This is your wake-up call, not from trauma, but from habit. From the thousand small things that seemed too minor to matter, until they became who you are. 1. When love begins to choke, they speak softly. They offer help you didn't ask for. They call it protection, concern, loyalty. But somehow your world begins to shrink. Little decisions become conversations. Your choices start requiring approval. And it happens so gently, so rationally, you barely notice your autonomy eroding. They don't demand, they suggest. They don't shout, they sigh. But each suggestion carries weight. You begin to hesitate before speaking your mind. You second-guess plans, interests, friends. What you think is harmony is actually surrender. Because what's being taken from you isn't just space, but voice. Jung saw it clearly. True care never seeks to reshape. Control disguised as affection is still control. The tragedy is not only that it changes you, but that it convinces you the change was your idea. That's the art of subtle domination, making you complicit in your own limitation. Control isn't always about force. Sometimes it wears the face of love. It often starts with something that appears benign. A well-timed suggestion, a carefully worded question. The first time, it might even seem thoughtful. They want to know where you are, how you're doing, whether you've eaten. It feels like intimacy, until you notice that every check-in carries an expectation. Over time, their concern begins to steer your decisions. Not through demand, but through anticipation. You begin to shape your life around their pote and tile reactions, and that's when you stop choosing for yourself. What follows is subtle reprogramming. You start filtering your behavior, not because it's wrong, but because you don't want to trigger disapproval. Their silence becomes a signal, their disappointment a threat. They never raise their voice, but the weight of their expectations presses down harder than any shouted command, and still you think it's your fault. That's the brilliance of control disguised as care. It shifts the responsibility onto you. You begin to apologize for having needs. You explain yourself before you're even questioned. You slowly forget what it felt like to exist freely. Jung warned that the psyche cannot grow where fear is constant. When your choices are shaped by another's moods, you are not relating, you are surviving. And that kind of survival has a cost. You lose your instincts. You second-guess your joy. You begin to shrink in places you once felt safe. And this isn't just about romantic partners. It happens in friendships, in family, yes, in workplace hierarchies. The pattern is always the same. Care becomes a currency used to purchase compliance, and you pay with pieces of yourself. Eventually, you'll look back and wonder when the silence inside you got so loud. That's the moment you'll know. What you thought was love was a kind of quiet imprisonment. Freedom doesn't always come from breaking chains. Sometimes it begins when you stop calling your cage a home. 2. The joke that bends the spine. It never begins as cruelty. It enters with a smirk, wrapped in playfulness, surrounded by people who all pretend it's nothing. The room laughs. You don't. But you do. Because not laughing isolates you more than the joke ever could. This is where harm wears a costume. It shows up in phrases designed to bruise without looking brutal. I'm just kidding. Don't be so serious. Learn to take a joke. These are the shields that protect the offender while cutting into the one who's supposed to take it. Mockery, when consistent and targeted, doesn't just hurt feelings. It reshapes your identity. Jung understood that the psyche interprets all repetition as reality. If you are continually cast as weak, dumb, emotional, or irrelevant, eventually, those labels begin to settle in your bones. The danger is not in a single insult, but in normalization. When ridicule becomes routine, you start scanning for it before it arrives. You brace for laughter before you speak. Your language shifts, your humor adapts, and piece by piece your expression is tailored to prevent humiliation. Even more insidious is when the ridicule comes from people you love. When family or partners or close friends are the ones laughing, it becomes harder to name it as harm. You convince yourself they don't mean it. You tell yourself it's just how they show affection. But affection that relies on belittlement isn't love. It's domination disguised as familiarity. Eventually, the fear of being the target keeps you from ever standing fully in your truth. You shrink to avoid attention. You let them rewrite your edges, dull your colors, not because you agree, but because the alternative, conflict, rejection, exclusion, feels worse. Jung warned that we often allow the external world to define our internal one. If we do not defend the boundary between perception and self, we lose the ability to distinguish who we are from what we are called. So, it's not just a joke. It's never just a joke. It's a test of whether you'll speak up, of whether you'll pretend you're fine to keep the peace, of whether you'll let yourself be the punchline in exchange for a seat at the table. And if the price of inclusion is your dignity, it's not worth the invitation. 3. The war of gaslighting. You used to trust your memory. Not perfectly. Nobody does. But enough to know when something felt off. Then slowly you started questioning it. Not because you forgot, but because someone else made forgetting seem safer than insisting. You'd mention something they said, and they'd say it never happened. You'd recall a detail. They'd smile like you imagined it. That quiet, disarming confidence with which they rewrote reality. That's how it starts. Gaslighting doesn't scream, it doesn't accuse. It tilts the world just enough that you begin to doubt your footing. You feel uneasy, but you can't find the reason. And when you do speak up, you're told you're being dramatic. So you begin shrinking your reactions, filtering your instincts, censoring your truth. Eventually, you learn to apologize even when you're the one in pain. Jung understood that confusion isn't a failure of intellect, it's a survival mechanism. When external reality feels unstable, the mind bends inward to preserve cohesion. You'll believe anything, even a lie, if it promises emotional safety. But emotional safety built on distortion is a trap, not a home. The worst part is what it leaves behind, a split self. The part of you that still remembers the truth fights with the version that wants to be agreeable, loved, accepted. The internal dissonance doesn't show up as conflict. It shows up as exhaustion, doubt, or an inability to trust even your own intuition. Not because you lack wisdom, but because that wisdom has been overridden too many times. Recovering from gaslighting means learning to sit in your own knowing again. Not with certainty, but with courage. It means noticing the moments where you instinctively defer and choosing to pause instead. It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about restoring the space where your own voice is enough. 4. The brutality of being dismissed. It doesn't take much to make someone feel invisible. Sometimes it's a raised eyebrow, a quick sigh, a change of subject mid-sentence. You were halfway through explaining what hurt, and suddenly you're apologizing for bringing it up. The moment passes, but something in you folds inward. Again, emotional invalidation is subtle. It isn't always cruel, and that's why it's so effective. It often sounds like logic or concern or indifference masquerading as neutrality. You're overthinking it. You always make things more complicated than they are. These aren't just throwaway remarks, they are quiet permissions for you to disconnect from yourself. Jung observed that the psyche cannot tolerate prolonged dismissal without consequence. When your emotional experiences are met with indifference or mockery, they don't disappear. They are driven underground. And what festers there doesn't stay still. It finds other ways out through insomnia, through isolation, through unexplained resentment. Being dismissed enough times rewires how you perceive yourself. You start minimizing your own emotions before anyone else does. You begin to believe that needing space or clarification or expression is too much, that your presence is only welcome when it's convenient. The most dangerous effect isn't that others stop hearing you, it's that you stop speaking at all. Not out loud, not even in your head. You lose touch with your emotional bearings, and in that silence, you become someone who exists to accommodate others while abandoning yourself. Reclaiming your voice isn't loud. It doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like choosing to name something even when it's inconvenient. It looks like letting a pause stretch awkwardly instead of filling it with self-blame. It looks like honoring the small tremors in your chest as data, not weakness. You are not a burden for feeling. You were just made to feel that way by those too scared to face their own reflection in your pain. They didn't scream, they didn't hit, they just looked away. There's a kind of cruelty that hides behind calm expressions. It doesn't storm into the room. It sits across from you, blinking slowly, telling you you're too sensitive. It smiles politely as it misses your hurt like a rumor, and in that moment you feel it, the emotional equivalent of being ghosted while still in the same room. Dismissal isn't about volume, it's about absence wrapped in presence. It's when someone is close enough to hear you but chooses not to register what you say. You describe how something affected you. They shrug. You cry softly. They check their phone. You ask for time, they offer nothing. This is where internal erosion begins. Not with trauma, but with consistent minimization. It's the death of expression through 1,000 muffled moments. You begin censoring yourself before the other person has a chance to do it for you. Eventually, you anticipate their indifference and bypass your own voice entirely. Jung noted that repressed emotion doesn't vanish. It transfigures. The sadness you were told was nothing to cry about becomes migraines. The fear you were told was irrational becomes avoidance. The needs you labeled too much become numbness. Nothing is wasted. It simply waits for its next exit. But even more corrosive than being silenced is learning to silence yourself. You don't only stop explaining how you feel, you stop knowing how you feel. Emotional clarity becomes fog. And in that fog, your identity fades. Healing begins not with being heard by others, but by relearning how to hear yourself without flinching, without preemptively shaming what arises. To honor your internal voice without asking it to justify its tone. That's what reclaiming sounds like. Not louder, just real. 5. Weaponized silence. There's a kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it chills. Not because it's quiet, but because it's deliberate. You text, no response. You speak, no reaction. You exist, and that's treated as optional. This is not absence. It's erasure. Being ignored as a strategy is not the same as someone needing space. It's not a missed call. It's not forgetting a reply. It's calculated withholding designed to make you question your value, and eventually you do. You measure your worth by how quickly they respond. You track their moods like weather forecasts. The silence becomes a mirror, and all you see is vacancy. Jung spoke of this dynamic as spiritual exile, being present yet unseen. It fractures something ancient within us. Humans are wired for recognition. We find ourselves reflected in others. So when that reflection vanishes, we start doubting if we're really there. Over time, you begin to preempt the silence. You become smaller, quieter, less honest, not out of growth, but fear. You rehearse your words, anticipate reactions, shape your presence around the possibility of being ignored, and that's how contempt settles in. Not with insults, but with indifference. What makes it sinister is the plausibility. They can always say, "You're overreacting, I just needed time." So you second-guess your pain. But deep down, you know, there's a difference between space and punishment. Freedom begins when you stop accepting absence as affection, when you stop making excuses for people who vanish when you need them most, when you start recognizing that being silent in the face of connection isn't maturity, it's control. You were not born to beg for acknowledgement. You were born to be met fully, you say, not partially, not sometimes, fully. You learned not to ask twice. You learned that silence meant you should know better. You learned that being ignored wasn't an accident, it was a signal. And so you started editing yourself before anyone else needed to. There's a cruelty to being deliberately invisible. It doesn't break you immediately. It empties you. Not with drama, with vacancy, with the space where connection should have lived. Jung understood this silent cruelty as a psychic fracture. When a person becomes accustomed to being emotionally ghosted, they adapt by internalizing the absence. They make it make sense. Maybe you deserved it. Maybe you were too needy. Maybe this is just what love looks like when it's tired. But the truth is simpler. Silence, when used as a weapon, is a way to control without appearing controlling. It's about power disguised as detachment. And it's especially insidious because it leaves no fingerprints, just your own growing doubt. Over time, you stop asking questions. You avoid saying what matters. You tiptoe around discomfort because somewhere along the way, you learn that disappearing was always a risk, one that came as punishment for needing too much, too often. And here's the paradox. The more silence you receive, the more noise you carry inside, conversations you'll never have, closure you'll never get, arguments you replay in your mind with no one. In the other end, you become fluent in unsaid things. True healing isn't about breaking the silence. It's about unlearning the idea that your presence was ever too much. It's remembering that attention is not a favor. It's a basic form of acknowledgement. And if someone withholds it to control you, they were never listening in the first place. 6. Sacrifice as identity. You've been told it's beautiful to give everything, that love means putting others first, that patience means silence, that kindness means disappearing when it's convenient for someone else. So you gave, and gave, and gave, until what was left wasn't love. It was absence. There's a story woven into many cultures that virtue lies in self-denial, that the highest expression of humanity is found in the quiet, dutiful martyr. But Jung warned, the psyche ought thrive in suppression. Self-sacrifice without authenticity is not compassion, it's erasure, and it leaves you stranded in a life where your needs are seen as threats. What makes it hard to notice is that this behavior often gets rewarded. People praise you for being so easygoing, so flexible, so strong, but they never ask what it costs you. They never notice the fatigue behind your politeness. They assume that just because you never say no, it must mean you're fine, but being agreeable isn't the same as being whole, and constantly minimizing your needs doesn't make you noble, it makes you disappear. There's a grief that comes from realizing how many of your choices were made out of fear. Fear of disappointing someone, fear of being alone, fear of being called selfish. And yet, the longer you abandon yourself, the harder it is to find your way back. Returning to yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. It's remembering that you're not responsible for everyone else's comfort, that your boundaries are not walls, they're architecture. They give shape to your presence. They keep you from leaking out of your own life. You do not have to be the hero of someone else's story if it means becoming a stranger in your own. You weren't praised for having boundaries. You were praised for not needing any. You were called selfless, but what they really meant was convenient. You learned early on that love came with a condition. Make yourself small, agreeable, adaptable. Keep the peace. Make everyone else comfortable, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. But what happens when you internalize sacrifice as your worth? You stop checking where the line is between generosity and self-erasure, and eventually there is no line. You give and give until giving becomes identity and receiving becomes guilt. Jung warned that when the ego attaches itself to the idea of being good, it loses access to the self, the core of who you are beyond roles, beyond approval. And once you've built your value around being the helper, the healer, the reliable one, any attempt to say no feels like betrayal. But here's the truth few are willing to say. Not every sacrifice is sacred. Some are symptoms. Some are escape routes from your own unresolved fear of rejection. Some are transactions where you pay in pieces of yourself, hoping to buy permanence in someone else's life. When you finally pause, really pause, and ask yourself, what part of me have I buried in order to be loved? The answer may frighten you, but that fear is necessary. It's the first sign of awakening. Reclaiming your right to exist without earning it through pain is the hardest kind of freedom. You'll be tempted to fall back into old patterns, to serve instead of speak, to smile instead of draw a line. But this time you'll know the cost. You were not born to be a container for other people's comfort. You were born to be whole, even if that means being inconvenient. 7. The final surrender. At the end of this long road, after the manipulation, the erasure, the humiliation, the silence, there's one final step. It's not loud, it's not violent, it's resignation. The quiet agreement that this is just how things are. You stop fighting. You convince yourself that the smallness you feel is normal, that everyone settles, that expecting more is unrealistic. So you shrink your hopes, your voice, your presence. You tell yourself it's better to be told, rated than alone. This is the psychic death Jung warned about, the place where you no longer recognize yourself, not because you changed, but because you were rewritten. Not all at once, but in tiny edits. A word left unsaid, a truth softened, a no that turned into a maybe. You become fluent in your own disappearance. The tragedy isn't that others did this to you, it's that you accepted it as fair. That you adapted to rejection like it was weather. That you treated contempt like it was a compromise. Reclaiming your life at this point isn't dramatic. It won't come with applause. It may start as a whisper, something inside you stirring, uncertain but insistent. A sense that you're not meant to be this quiet, this small, this erased. You don't need permission to belong to yourself. You don't need validation to re-enter your life. All you need is the willingness to stop participating in your own erasure. You've survived by tolerating. Now it's time to live by refusing. You never owes contempt. Not directly. You chose belonging. You chose not to be alone. You chose to keep someone near even if they made you feel far from yourself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you began trading pieces of your soul for the illusion of proximity. You stopped voicing your truth because it made others uncomfortable. You stopped setting boundaries because you feared they'd leave. And when they hurt you, you rationalized it. At least they're still here. Jung called this soul death. Not a collapse, but a surrender. A point at which you're not alive, just functioning. where every decision is made to avoid abandonment, not to honor your core. You wear masks so long you forget where your face begins. The tragedy of this behavior is that it feels like safety. It feels like compromise. It feels like maturity. But it's not. It's survival. And survival without truth is a slow burn of the self, an internal exile. You justify their silence. You excuse their sarcasm. You adapt to their absence. But deep down, a question begins to form. What would happen if I stopped settling? It's faint at first, but it grows louder every time you betray yourself. And the answer is terrifying. You might lose people. You might face nights full of silence. You might feel emptier than ever before. But that emptiness, that's not loneliness, that's space. Space for the self you abandoned to return. Space for truth to speak without fear of rejection. To choose authenticity over acceptance isn't easy, but it's real. And anything less than real, no matter how familiar, will never feed your soul. You don't need to be tolerated. You need to be true. There comes a point where discomfort becomes unbearable, not because it gets louder, but because your silence finally cracks. You see it now. The patterns, the bargains, the slow unraveling of who you used to be. Not all at once, but enough to make you pause, enough to make you question why you kept saying yes to things that made you feel smaller. Jung didn't offer comfort, he offered clarity, and clarity demands action. This isn't about blame, this isn't about revenge, it's about recognition. It's about tracing your way back to the parts of you that stopped speaking, and giving them space to return. Yes, the cost of change is steep, but the cost of staying quiet is your life. You don't owe anyone your erosion. You don't have to explain why you're done tolerating what hurts you. The shift won't be dramatic. It won't look brave. It might look like a pause before you respond, a breath before you agree, a goodbye that never turns into an apology. That's how you take yourself back, not with noise, but with refusal. What you begin to name, you begin to heal. And what you refuse to carry no longer owns you.